welcome to the Continuing Pathways to Peace lecture series. My name is Jackie Schreier. I'm the Executive Director of the Jewish Federation of Fort Wayne. Before we start, can I ask all of you, and I'm so pleased I remembered to do this myself, please turn off your cell phones if you have not yet done that. We are able to offer this series thanks to the generosity of the Dr. Harry W. Salin Foundation, the Dr. Lewis and Ann B. Schneider Foundation, and the Jewish Federation of Fort Wayne. If you have not already signed up to receive our email updates, please do so at the table at the back of the room. In addition, we welcome you to join the Jewish Federation, and the forms are available also at that table. Our federation was organized in 1921. It was primarily a welfare and relief organization that coordinated the work and the communal fundraising for the entire Jewish community. In 1939, Fort Wayne hired its first executive director. In subsequent years, the Federation developed into a multifaceted organization serving young and old in the areas of social services, education and cultural programs, leadership development, community relations, and fundraising. In fact, the Fort Wayne Jewish Federation was one of the founding agencies of the Community Chest. It still is considered a community leader in the efforts to reduce and eliminate prejudice. The Federation serves as a central coordinating fundraising, budgeting, and social agency for the Fort Wayne Jewish community. It is affiliated with the Jewish Federations of North America, which is a national organization of 183 Jewish federations servicing communities in the United States and Canada. The topic of tonight's lecture is the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. Is a peace agreement a realistic possibility? Out of courtesy for tonight's speaker, please refrain from asking questions or making loud comments during his presentation. We have allowed time for questions and answer, and we'll make every attempt to answer your questions thoroughly. Please continue to enjoy some light refreshments at the back. And now I would like to welcome Dr. Matthew Farber, who will introduce our speaker.
Good evening. Thank you for joining us this evening. It's really my distinct pleasure to get to introduce tonight's speaker. Since completing his PhD, Dr. Nurnberger has spent his career in varying capacities working in Washington, D.C., in the legislative area, working on the staff of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, various positions in the executive branch in departments of commerce and the GSA. He was the first executive director of the Builders for Peace program. He helped raise millions of dollars in an effort to promote development in the area of infrastructure, energy, and water projects, hoping this can further the road to peace. Throughout his career, he has been able to share his insights with students in an erudite and entertaining manner. And I'm sure that we won't be disappointed tonight. Not surprisingly, he has won more than one teaching award, and it really doesn't come as any surprise to me. I remember when Ralph was my high school history teacher, and he was really super great. So I know that we're all interested in hearing what insights he has to the Middle East peace process, the prospects for the future. Let us introduce Dr. Ralph Nurnberger.
It's such a pleasure to be back in Fort Wayne. I had the good fortune of being here a couple of years ago. Matt, obviously I must have been such a good history teacher that he decided not to go into history and went into medicine instead. When you look at the Middle East, things never turn out the way you want them to, or the way you expect. And probably when we focus on the peace process, bear that in mind. Every one of us has our own favorite stories about how things don't turn out the way you expect. Mine is the story of three brothers whose mother was going to celebrate a significant birthday. And so each of them decided to give her something special for her birthday. One of them went out and bought her a brand new car, a Mercedes, and or something equivalent, and hired a chauffeur because she was getting up in years and wanted to make sure that she would be able to get around. Well, that put a lot of pressure on brother number two, so he went out and bought her a brand new house in a fancy neighborhood, and then furnished it with the best furniture he could get. Well, that put real pressure on the third brother, so he started asking for people's advice on what should I do? And finally someone told him that there was a rabbi in Jerusalem who had somehow been able to teach a parrot to recite the Torah. So he flies to Jerusalem, and sure enough, he finds this rabbi, and he says, is it true? Yes. Can I see the bird? The guy goes into the basement, brings the bird up, he does the prompts, and suddenly this bird beautifully starts reciting segments of the Torah. And he says, I need to buy this bird for my mother. And the guy says, I'm very sorry, it's taken me 40 years or however long to train the bird to do this. I can't sell it. And my son is going to be a rabbi, and I promised for him, for his congregation, that he would have the bird when I die. $1 million. No, I won't take any money. They argue, they haggle. Guy goes back to his hotel. The next day comes back, and they start arguing again and haggling. Finally, he buys the bird and gets it back into the United States. I don't know how he gets it through TSA, and gives it to the mother. A couple of weeks later, on the actual date of the birthday, they all go out for dinner, and the mother says, I want to thank each of you for your wonderful gifts. It was so kind and considerate and generous of each of you, but there are some problems. The car, I don't go around that much anymore. I'm old, and the driver, he's sometimes rude, but we're not going to use the car that much, so when I die, you'll probably get most of your money back. The house is gorgeous, and the furniture is really lovely, and it's such a good neighborhood, but it's such difficult to keep it clean, and it's so big. I really didn't need that much, but real estate values are going up, and when I die, you're going to make money. On the other hand, that funny-looking chicken was delicious. So, in the Middle East, things just don't turn out the way you want. Winston Churchill once described the conflict that we're going to talk about. I don't understand why the Jews and the Muslims can't solve their problems like good Christians. When Jackie and I were talking about what she wanted me to cover today, she said, talk about the entire Middle East, because you can't take the Arab-Israeli conflict out of the context of the neighborhood, and talk about what's going on in Syria, in Jordan, in Lebanon, in Egypt, and then the Israeli-Palestinian dispute. And by the way, the basketball game starts at 8. In words that Henry VIII is supposed to have told all of his wives, don't worry, I won't keep you here long. Let me start briefly, because obviously each of these topics could be a full talk unto itself, and just give a few thoughts about the neighborhood. Golda Meir was once asked, when will Israel learn to live with its neighbors the way the United States lives with Canada? And she says, as soon as Israel has as its neighbor Canada. When you look around, obviously the first place you have to start is the horrific events taking place in Syria. 3 years ago, the population of Syria was 23 million, between 22 and 23 million. Of those, over 9 million are no longer living where they did 3 years ago. That means 9 million are basically refugees. Of those, somewhere between 2.5 and 3 million are out of the country. This makes it the single largest refugee problem since World War II. We are going to talk a little bit about the Palestinian refugees and about Jews who left Arab countries and moved to Israel in the late 1940s. No one knows the exact number. The UN gives a number of 714,000. How they come up with that, I don't know. So ballpark 700,000, give or take 200,000. Because the Israelis say it was between 400,000 and 500,000, the Arabs say it was 900,000, so whatever. We're now talking 2.5 to 3 million. The Syrians are now using a different form of chemical weapons called chlorine bombs, which just arrived courtesy of Iran, which is sending them there. We don't even know who the bad guys and the good guys are, because there are no good guys. Assad Jr., we thought he was going to be much better than his father. Matt and I were talking about him being an ophthalmologist. He was trained in London. He married this rich Lebanese woman who was a banker in London. He's the type of ophthalmologist you go to if you want your eyes poked out. And the situation in Syria has gotten and continues to get worse. The destruction of buildings and infrastructure. If the war stopped tomorrow, I'm not sure where the funds would come to rebuild what has already been destroyed. The opposition to Assad is totally divided among themselves. For example, there are two groups, each claiming to be affiliated with Al-Qaeda. The Al-Nusra group and something called ISIS, the Islamic group of Syria and Iraq. The problem is they are so violent that Al-Qaeda has disowned them. You can't make that up. Zawahiri, who's now heading Al-Qaeda now that bin Laden has died, said, we can't sanction a group that is so violent. And they're the ones who are going against Assad. And Assad is being backed by Iran and Hezbollah. So we certainly don't want him to win either. It is very possible that we may see a total ending of the border and boundary lines that were created in the World War I period. I don't know how many of you know how the borders in the Middle East were drawn. The border between what is now Lebanon and Syria and Iraq on the north, and Israel and Jordan, again using modern names, was a result of an agreement reached between a French bureaucrat named Georges Picot and a British bureaucrat by the name of Mark Sykes. And the way the line was drawn was Sykes was told to come up with a line. He went to his desk in London and took a map and connected the E in the city of Acre to the second K in the city of Kirkuk and drew a line, and that's how the borders were drawn. The borders between Syria and Iraq are virtually gone, with terror groups going back and forth. And jihadists from around the world are now going into Syria, learning how to kill. I read in my clips this morning that ISIS, based in Syria, is now trying to figure out how they can put attacks against Europe and the United States. The other problem is obviously refugees. There's somewhere around 800,000 refugees who have come into Jordan. The Zatari refugee camp in northwest Jordan is the fourth largest city in Jordan now. It wasn't there a year ago in August. 150 to 180,000 people. 50,000 children, there are 3 schools. Lack of housing, medical care, certainly lack of education. Syrian men are raping Syrian girls because they can. 1 out of every 4 people today in Lebanon is a Syrian refugee. It is disrupting Lebanon. When we look at what's going on in Egypt right now, the Muslim Brotherhood, from my perspective, fortunately is out. In all likelihood, General Sisi will be elected as the next president of Egypt, and he is saying a lot of the right things, but he is doing a lot of the wrong things. And so we are certainly facing a very difficult situation there. Remarkably, when you look at the Arab-Israeli conflict, it's probably the only moment of calm in the region. Who would have thought that? The situation certainly is extremely difficult. When I look at the Arab-Israeli conflict, I'm reminded that there are 2 problems that mankind has been unable to solve in the last 70 years. The first is, why did Japanese kamikaze pilots wear helmets? Yeah. And the second is, will there ever be peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians? So today let's talk about the helmets. Let me give you a very quick background. When you approach the issues of the Arab-Israeli conflict, you really only have to look at 6 issues. There are hundreds of issues. Everything from passports and visas and people moving back and forth and medical care and taxation and funds going one way or the other, postage stamps, currency, environment, water, the list just goes on and on. Ignore them all. Pay attention to 6. Number 1, should there be 1, 2, or 3 states between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean? Should there be a state of Israel, or should there be a state of Israel and Palestine or Palestines? Because the West Bank and Gaza are quite different, and maybe the Palestinians need 2 states rather than 1, so it's unclear whether there should be Israel and Palestine or Israel and 2 Palestines. But in any case, is there a 1-state solution or a 2-state solution? And if so, what should the borders be? This is a real estate question. How do you draw the lines so that this is Israel and this is Palestine? So issue number 1, borders. Issue number 2, recognition. Both sides have to recognize the legitimacy of the other as a state, as an entity, if there is to be a 2-state solution. Whatever you call it. In the recent talks, the Israelis made a big pitch for Israel to be recognized by the world as the Jewish state of Israel. The U.S. compromise was that it should be called Israel, the state of the Jewish people, and the Palestinians don't want the word Jew in the state name. There are those in the Jewish community who say that there are only 3 states that have a religion in their title: Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iran. And why does Israel want to be a 4th with those 3 in the same category? But again, recognizing 2 states, mutual recognition. Third issue, security. Is there a way that people in their daily lives will be secure in their daily lives? That an Israeli mother can put her kid on a bus and not worry that the kid is going to get blown up going to or from school. And that a Palestinian woman who is pregnant isn't going to get stopped so many times by Israeli police and IDF in the West Bank that she gives birth on the road. That people in their daily lives aren't going to be harassed by military or police, or the worry of an attack by a terrorist. How do you do that? And in terms of the recent talks, the security issue for Israel came to an issue revolving around control of the Jordan Valley, near the Jordan River, because there was a concern that should there be a Palestinian state, bad guys and bad things may cross from Jordan into that, and how do you ensure that no contraband and no terrorists will cross at that point? The next issue to pay attention to is refugees, specifically Palestinian refugees, people who left what is today Israel during what Israel calls the War of Independence and what the Palestinians call the Nakba, the catastrophe. By the way, today is Catastrophe Day in Palestine. It's Nakba Day. Again, as I mentioned, there's somewhere around 700,000 Palestinians or Arabs who left their homes and wound up, many of them, in refugee camps in Jordan, West Bank, Syria, and elsewhere. What's remarkable about those Palestinian refugees who wound up in Syria, the largest Palestinian refugee camp in Syria is located in a suburb of Damascus. In recent months, it has been shelled repeatedly, and it is completely unsafe for the people to live there. The only place that will not take Palestinian refugees from the Palestinian refugee camp in Syria is the Palestinians. They won't take their own cousins because they feel that taking them in prejudices the end result of what they refer to as the right of return. Now, don't underestimate this term right of return. If you read the Palestinian debates in the 1950s when the term was first came up, they deliberately chose the phrase right as part of the American Bill of Rights, and they view their right to go home as their number one right. Interestingly enough, there was an equivalent number of Jews who left Arab countries at about the same time, leaving to go to the new state of Israel in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Again, ballpark 700, 800,000. You may see a number of 400,000, you may see a number of 900,000. It's not totally clear, but essentially the same number of people. And what's interesting is, what are those people called who left the Arab countries and are now living in Israel? They're called Israelis. They're not called refugees anymore. They were welcomed into society as if they were coming from anywhere else. But the Palestinians and their descendants still desire to go home. And in many cases, obviously, those homes are not there, and so the issue of right of return is critical to the national identity of the Palestinians. The fifth issue is the status of some city. I can't find it in my notes quickly. It rhymes with Jerusalem. Is there a way of coming up with something creative in terms of the future of Jerusalem so that everyone can claim victory? Because if everyone does not claim victory, the feud and the dispute continues. So is there a creative way of dividing, sharing, doing something with Jerusalem so that everyone is happy? Also, defining what is Jerusalem. I spoke recently and I asked, what is Jerusalem? And a person said, we want Jerusalem to be the same as it was during biblical times. And my answer was, if you do that, you're going to be very, very unhappy because it was small. And you're going to wind up giving up a lot more than you want. Someone else said it should be the area of Jerusalem that Israel was able to reunite in 1967. I said, you're going to be very unhappy too, because suburban sprawl in Jerusalem has grown. So should areas that were not in Jerusalem in 1967 be in Jerusalem today when you come up with the way of dividing the city? And even more important, how do you deal with the holy places? There's some very creative ideas of joint sovereignty or different groups having control over the various holy places. And the final issue is 3 words: end of conflict. At the end of the day, will the Israeli leader, today Netanyahu, but who knows tomorrow, and the Palestinian leader, today Abbas, but who knows tomorrow, be able to go to their own people and say, this is over? Now, no one expects Israel and the Palestinians to develop warm and fuzzy great relations. It's possible. England and France fought each other for hundreds of years. France and Germany fought each other for hundreds of years and now get along quite well. But I don't think that's likely. Israel and Egypt signed a peace agreement. Warm and fuzzy? Never was. But they didn't fight each other. So, is it possible? Yes. But it's inordinately difficult. With that as the background, let me explain where we are now. Because what has happened in the last 2 weeks was the collapse of a monumental effort by the Obama administration, specifically Secretary Kerry. And when I look at what's happened, I'm reminded of a comment made by former U.S. Ambassador to Israel, Sam Lewis, who unfortunately passed away a couple of weeks ago. Sam Lewis said that there are 3 stages of death in the Middle East. You can be dead, you can be dead and buried, and you can be dead, buried, and not likely to be resurrected. In the Middle East, you have to be careful, because it leads the world in resurrections. The peace process right now is dead and buried, and it will be resurrected because it has to be. Because at some point, you're going to have to deal with the issues. When Obama became president, in his inaugural address in January of 2009, he spoke about the Arab-Israeli peace process as one of the top foreign policy priorities that he wanted to pursue in his first administration. And if someone had told me in January of 2009, or in the spring of 2009, that in the first 4 years of the first Obama administration, he would accomplish on this issue absolutely, positively nothing, I wouldn't have believed it. He talked about it in his inaugural address. On day 2 of his presidency, he announces the appointment of George Mitchell to be the peace negotiator between the Israelis and the Palestinians. George Mitchell, former Senate Majority Leader. George Mitchell, who had brought about the peace in Ireland. George Mitchell, who had investigated drugs in baseball. In fact, I was on a plane with George, with whom I play tennis, and is a good friend. And I told him even God is a baseball fan, because the Bible starts in the big inning. That may hit some of you on the way home. Bush Sr. and Clinton had a fellow named Dennis Ross in that job. Dennis is probably among the top diplomats this country has produced in recent generations. There's just not enough good things to say about his ability and his character. But Ross announced that he would not stay on in that job after the 2000 elections, regardless of whether Bush or Gore won. When Bush came in, he wanted to be the non-Clinton in everything, in his personal life, in his domestic politics, tax policy, you name it, he was going to do it differently, and so he did not replace Ross. Every once in a while, he had a temporary peace negotiator. You may remember he had General Zinni at one point. I still remember General Zinni's press conference, and they asked him, how long are you going to stay in the region? And he said, until there's peace. And I said, this man's making aliyah. So appointing someone of the stature of Mitchell, major step forward. Obama's first press conference as president, television interview as president, was with Hisham Melhem of Al Arabi Television. And he said, my first and top foreign policy priority is to bring peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Hillary Clinton's first trip as Secretary of State was to the region. Obama's first 2 major trips in the area, one was to Turkey and one was to Cairo, where again, in the Cairo speech, some criticized him because he didn't continue on to Israel. By the way, only 2 American presidents have ever visited Israel in their first term, Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton. Reagan never went to Israel during his life, and obviously Bush Sr. didn't make it when he was president. Bush Jr. didn't make it to Israel until his 7th year. But when in his Cairo speech, he talked about it's time for the Arabs to recognize Israel, to recognize that the Holocaust took place, and to begin a peace process. He begins by putting pressure on Netanyahu, who had just been elected as prime minister for his second go-round, and gets Netanyahu to utter 3 words that he'd never said before in a speech at Bar-Ilan University, where he says, the solution is a 2-state solution. Wow, major breakthrough by Bibi. Looks like we're headed in the right direction. And then it all falls apart. In large measure because Obama and Netanyahu did not develop good enough relations. There was a lack of trust between them. In large measure because the United States, Obama administration, put too much emphasis on trying to get the Israelis to have a settlement freeze. A freeze on the construction of new housing in East Jerusalem and in the West Bank, Judea-Samaria, if you will, which even Israelis who oppose settlement expansion felt was inappropriate for the United States to do because they felt that it would be impinging upon Israeli domestic issues. Finally, with a great deal of effort, the Obama administration got the Netanyahu administration to agree to a 10-month settlement freeze. The first 9.5 months of that were totally wasted. Abbas did nothing, and then with 2 weeks left, he and Netanyahu finally met, and then Abbas said, well, will you extend the settlement freeze? And Netanyahu said, no, you had 10 months, you didn't show up. And it fell apart. And basically, at the end of the first Obama term, in terms of the Arab-Israeli conflict, we were no better off than we were when he got in. When Obama was reelected and Secretary Kerry replaced Hillary Clinton, On his first day in office on February 4 last year, Kerry said he is going to make the Arab-Israeli conflict a top priority for his efforts. Obama then agrees to go to Israel and went last March 20th of last year. And he learned a lot of lessons from his failures and his mistakes in the first term. This time he gets off the plane, walks down the red carpet, grabs Sarah Netanyahu and yanks her between himself and Bibi and says, now the photographers can take a picture of a rose between two thorns. For those who said that Obama thought that Israel was created out of the Holocaust, he goes to the Shrine of the Book, which is where the Dead Sea Scrolls are kept, to say, I know Israel and the Jews have a 2,000 or 3,000 year heritage in this land. He takes a stone from the Martin Luther King Memorial in Washington and drops it on the grave of Theodore Herzl. Instead of speaking to the Knesset, he goes and speaks to 2,000 young people and tells them, it's up to you to tell your leaders it's time to make peace. He goes to Ramallah and meets with Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen, and says, settlements may continue, but if you make peace, it doesn't become an issue, because then you will have your own state, and the issue of settlements will be diffused. And the most important thing he does is he appoints Kerry as his negotiator and the top person, point person on this issue. Kerry looks at it and says, okay, I'm going to try. And a lot of people say, what a waste of effort. Jackson Deal, who heads the top foreign policy correspondent for the Washington Post, said this effort is going to be delusional. At the time, Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Ya'alon came to Washington, and I had the occasion to be in a small meeting with him, and I asked him if he thought that there would be peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians in the next 4 years, and he says, I don't think there's going to be peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians in my lifetime. Interestingly enough, the polling data between the Israelis and the Palestinians are virtually the same on this issue. The latest polls that I have seen, 75% of Israelis want a two-state solution to be achieved through negotiations, and 65% don't believe it's possible. They say, we've seen this movie before. Israel withdrew from Gaza, and Israel withdrew from Lebanon in 2000 and 2005. And what did they get in exchange? Rockets and missiles. A friend of mine and I were discussing recently, talking of seeing the movie before. There was a movie when I was younger where two detectives are in an apartment and they're looking across the elevated train. It's in New York. And a woman is about to get undressed, and the train comes rumbling by, and the train leaves, and she's in her pajamas. And my friend said he kept going to that movie because just once that train's going to be late. So we've seen that movie before. And what's to say it's going to come out differently this time? Palestinians, 68% want a two-state solution. Israel next to Palestine. And 82% don't believe it's possible. There's a lack of trust on both sides towards each other. Palestinians see more settlements going up and say we can't deal with the Israelis, they're taking our land. Israelis see incitement by Palestinians and see in the mosques and in the schools. They see school textbooks that don't have Israel in the maps. 2 months ago, the Kloss Sea, you may remember that, 50 tons of weapons were captured by the Israelis on their way to Gaza, being sent by Iran. Lack of trust, and for good reason. So Kerry looks at this and says, we're going to do this better. We're going to learn from the mistakes of past negotiations. What are these mistakes, and how do you fix it? Mistake number one, past efforts tried to rush it. You can't rush this. For example, Clinton brings Arafat and Barak to Camp David in the summer of 2000 for 2 weeks. Much too short. Clinton meets with Netanyahu and Arafat at Y Plantation in Maryland for 10 days. Bush Jr. gets everybody to come to Annapolis for 4 days. Kerry says no. 9 months. One of my friends says, I know other things that take 9 months, and I know how those got started. That's going to hit the rest of you on the way home. Next, the level of negotiators. Instead of having Netanyahu and Abbas be the negotiators, drop down a level and have the full-time negotiators be Tzipi Livni on the Israeli side, the justice minister, and since Bibi can't stand her and doesn't trust her, he appoints his personal lawyer, Yitzhak Molkow, to look over her shoulder to make sure she doesn't give away the story. And on the Palestinian side, Saab Erekat. So that should Livni and Erekat reach an agreement, Netanyahu and Abbas still have deniability and ability to change what comes out. Also, they can go about doing their jobs of running their respective countries. Next, the U.S. negotiators. He appoints probably the best team that the U.S. has to put out there, headed by my former office mate, Martin Indig. Martin originally came from Australia, had to give up his Australian citizenship in order to become the U.S. ambassador to Israel, and then later on became Assistant Secretary of State for Near East at State Department. Knows these issues cold, has written a wonderful book, Innocent Abroad, about the area. And everybody trusts and likes him. And he puts together a phenomenal team. I mentioned borders, and I'll come back to it. The world's leading expert on borders in the West Bank is David Makovsky, who is at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He gets him to take a leave of absence and join the team. One of the leading experts on security, General Allen, comes and only deals with security issues. So the U.S. team is top rate. Next, he goes to Tony Blair, the former Prime Minister of England, and says, can you raise between $4 and $6 billion should there be an agreement so that there's an economic component? If the Palestinians get a state, you don't want it to be a failed state, and their economy is awful. And Blair says, if there's an agreement, we will get money to pump into the Palestinian economy to get it going. Next, he gets the King of Morocco, Mohammed, the King of Morocco, who is, I believe, the 37th descendant of the Prophet Muhammad. I don't know. Heads something called the Al-Quds Committee, or Commission, because of his involvement with Muhammad. And they get all of the Arab countries, or Muslim countries, to agree that if the Israelis and the Palestinians reach an agreement on Jerusalem and both agree to it, they will buy into it. So Israel doesn't just get an agreement with the Palestinians, they get a much wider agreement. Then Kerry goes back and forth 12 times, 13 times, whatever the number is, and meets with everyone. Obama calls and meets with everyone. And so, in terms of doing things right, they did it. And they also said, we're going to talk about the crown jewels of the issue. We're going to focus on land, national identity, religion, security. We're not going to talk about nonsense. Well, they did. The first 3 months, they started arguing about what order should the issues come up. Because you can't divorce them. If you make a concession on borders, you need to get something on refugees. If you solve borders, you don't have to, you need to be able to do trade-offs. You can't separate the issues. You need to do them all at once. And it took them quite a few months before they came to the realization on how to deal with the issues. In order to get the talks started, both the Israelis and the Palestinians agreed to make a major concession to the other, to show good faith. The Israelis agreed to release 104 Palestinian prisoners. Why 104 instead of 100? I don't know. These were all guys who were in Israeli prisons prior to September 13, 1993, which was when the handshake took place on the White House lawn. They were all in for murder and terrorism. Not one of them was in for jaywalking. They were the worst of the worst. There were two guys who blew up a school bus, set it on fire, and killed children. And any of the children who escaped the bus, they shot. Now they're being released. This was a traumatic moment within Israel. The parents of these kids are saying, you're releasing the murderers of my children. A lobby group of the victims' families grew up in Israel and said, don't do this. And Netanyahu showed courage and said, I will. And agreed to release 104 of these awful people in 4 tranches of 26 each. And the Palestinians said, we will not go to the United Nations or international fora to seek a state of Palestine without having direct negotiations. We will not do this under any circumstance before April 29. Because Israel was fearful. I mean, the UN has 192 countries or whatever it is. If there was a vote in the General Assembly, it would be 190, 180, whatever, voting for Palestine. So Israel wanted to make sure that wouldn't happen. Those were the concessions by each side. Then it started to fall apart. And in March, both Netanyahu and Abbas came to Washington. Netanyahu came mainly to deliver a speech at the AIPAC Policy Conference, and then to meet with Obama. And he spoke at the AIPAC Policy Conference and said, I hope the Palestinian leadership will stand with Israel and the United States on the right side of the moral divide, on the side of peace, reconciliation, and hope. The President and I both understand that we have to make major concessions and compromises in order to reach the peace that will benefit all the people in the region. 2 days after that speech, Abbas spoke to the Fatah Revolutionary Council, in which he said, everyone knows what our principles are and what we can and will not change. Palestine's borders must be from the Jordan River to the 1967 lines. There can be no compromise. We cannot compromise regarding all of Jerusalem based on the 67 lines. There is an unquestioned right of return for all the refugees to the state of Israel, if that is where they wish to go. Under no circumstances can I or any Palestinian people accept a Jewish state in principle. And even if I did, since any agreement would have to be presented to the Palestinian people for their approval, it would be rejected. Wow. 2 totally different approaches by Netanyahu and Abbas, at least in public. Abbas then comes to Washington March 20th of this year and threatens to go to the UN and says he will not even discuss the question of whether or not there should be a Jewish state. Basically, both Netanyahu and Abbas failed to present to their own people why peace is good for them, and both of them have major blocks within their own peoples who do not want peace to proceed. Abbas was caving, and he was caving very quickly. Then it got worse. The Palestinians changed their mind on the last tranche of the 26 prisoners, suddenly saying 14 of the 26 should be Israeli Arabs who were in prison for murder, not Palestinians from the West Bank. Huge distinction. If you release a Palestinian who lives in the West Bank, a murderer, into the West Bank, it's going to be difficult for that person to commit crimes in Israel. They have to get over the barrier. If you release a Palestinian Arab into Israel, there's no barrier. And so the Israelis said, we're not doing that. You just changed the name and changed the game. Abbas then said, if you're not releasing the prisoners, I'm going to the UN. And signs 15 agreements with international organizations, most of which are pretty harmless. Human rights, rights for women, doesn't matter what they were. He signed them as president of the state of Palestine. Very significant on how that was done. The Israelis responded by then announcing 708 new houses to go up in the Gilo neighborhood of Jerusalem. So we're seeing this thing collapse. At this point, Kerry says, we're not going to get peace by April 29. Let's see if we can, as a minimum, get an agreement on what the issues are and where each side is. Can you, Israel, can you, Palestine, list the 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 issues that are important and what your views are on each. Both said no. The Israelis said, yeah, we can. The Palestinians said, no, we're not going to do that. So if you can't even deal with the framework, Kerry's next offer was, okay, we're not going to solve it by April 29. We're not going to get a framework by April 29. Let's see if we can extend the talks from April 29 to December. And I'm going to make an offer to both of you. Palestinians, don't make any agreements with the international organizations, and we're not only going to get 26 prisoners released, we're going to get 400 released by December. Israel, if you stay in the talks until December, we're going to release Jonathan Pollard. And a lot of people said, what? What does Jonathan Pollard have to do with this? Now, some of you may think Pollard should have been released long ago, and he spied for Israel, and others think Pollard should be where he is because he's a spy and he turned on his own country, and he didn't do it for love of Israel. Israel was the 4th country he went to try and sell this information. It had nothing to do with Zionism. It had to do with his drug problems and his desire for money. And so Pollard's a hero in Israel, right or wrong. And so the U.S. said, dangled Pollard out there, and it didn't work. And so now it looks like it's all falling apart. And then, I think it was April 24 or 25, Abbas suddenly comes out and says, we've reached an agreement to form a unity government with Hamas in Gaza. Now, Hamas is tremendously weakened because the Muslim Brotherhood collapsed in Egypt, and also their headquarters in Damascus had been shelled and blown up, basically. And Khalid Mashal, who is the head of Hamas, now lives in Qatar because he can't live in Damascus anymore. They're running short of money, they're weak, and they're groping. And Abbas says, I'm going to bring them into the peace process because you can't make peace with just one side of the Palestinians. If I bring in Hamas, this is a step for peace. The Israeli response was, they need to do the same 3 things we've said all along. Recognize Israel, renounce violence, and accept all past agreements. Abbas says, of course they'll do that, and we're going to have peace, and instead of just dealing with the PA, we're going to deal with all of us, and there'll be a unity government, and isn't this wonderful? Whereupon Hamas then issues a statement saying, no, we're going to destroy Israel, we don't accept Israel, we don't accept past agreements. Khalid Mashal made that statement in Qatar, and Ismail Haniyeh made it in Gaza. And Bibi Netanyahu said, if Hamas is part of the negotiating team, we're not showing up, and pulled out. And it fell apart. So that's where we are now. And the question is, do we move forward? Kerry met with Abbas this morning in London. Nothing came of it. Trying to get Abbas back into the peace process. It's going to be problematic. And I think, basically, we're going to put this on hold because we've got another date coming up, July 20th. On July 20th, in theory, an agreement will be put forward between Iran and the so-called P5+1, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council plus Germany, on a means of reducing the likelihood of Iran developing nuclear weapons. If they come up with an agreement, and I would not be surprised if they do, there is no way that Israel is going to be happy with that agreement. Because Iran is not going to move to what Israel wants, which is no enrichment at all. And so Netanyahu is going to go to Obama. It's going to suck the life out of a peace process. Bibi will go to Obama and say, hey, you can't do 2 things to me like this. I can't survive both. And so that will nail another coffin, or put another nail in the coffin of the peace process for now. And so basically what we're going to find is Israel, instead of trying to resolve the problem, will learn to continue to manage the problem. And it's only going to continue and fester. That said, what is remarkable is the economy of Israel is booming. And if you go to Israel today, and talk to people, cab drivers, people on the streets, your relatives, your friends, or anyone else, they don't even care about this. They've put it sort of behind them. We're not going to solve this. Let's move on with life. And they don't talk about it. The barriers preventing terrorist attacks, things are relatively quiet, and people are moving on with their lives, and the overall peace process is not going very far. Abbas, 79 years old, ostensibly has cancer. The Constitution of the Palestinians said that if he steps down, by the way, he is in the 10th year of his 4-year term. He was elected in January of 2005. So we obviously have not yet reached January of 2009. In 2010, he said he would not run for re-election in the elections that won't be held in 2011. Should Abbas withdraw, and there is no clear successor, the next president of the Palestinian Authority is a Hamas guy named Mohammed Dweeb. And Abbas doesn't want that either. So that's another thing motivating him in trying to get this going. Anyway, I have gone on much too long. I hope that I've at least set the stage for some good questions, which I would be glad to try and entertain. You want to watch the basketball game? Yes, sir.
There, you talked about the 70-year history since going back to 47 to 48 in the essentially stalemate situation which continues to exist. One thing that seems to me to blow up wide open would be if Iran and other entities start shipping a lot stronger weaponry into Gaza. And I believe that those missile shots have been going over longer and longer distances of time. And you can certainly envision where they could reach Tel Aviv and the whole thing could pull open. The Israelis have the military power and the control of the Mediterranean coast to seal up Gaza and keep them from getting those kinds of, keep the Palestinians there from obtaining those types of weapons, or is that something that can logically blow open and not be a stalemate at all?
Well, you always worry that something's going to get through. So I certainly agree with your basic premise. That said, two answers. In terms of getting weapons in, the Israelis, or into Gaza, the Israelis have done a remarkable job. For example, this Class C ship that they intercepted off the coast, I guess a month or 2 months ago, is a good example. But another example was the Karin A, which in 2001, they intercepted going to Gaza, and Arafat said, we know nothing about it. And unfortunately, the Israelis had the ship, and the captain said, well, of course Arafat told me to do this. Smaller weapons get in, but the Egyptians now, because they can't stand Hamas either, have closed up the tunnels. And so weapons going into Gaza has slowed down. That said, the Israelis also have developed, as you are aware, the Iron Dome, the Arrow, the David Shield, anti-missile systems that are absolutely remarkable. The Iron Dome, the first time I saw videos of it, I was told that it was able to knock out of the air 80% of the missiles shot at Israel. And I said, that sounds good, but that means 20% they're not shooting out. They said, no, it's so sophisticated, it knows that those won't land in harm, that they're going to land in the sand somewhere, and they don't bother. That's impressive. All that said, should missiles or attacks increase or become more lethal, all this ratchets up to a new level, and let's hope that doesn't happen. But that's obviously why you try and pursue a peace process, to make sure that it doesn't happen. So excellent question with a lot of different ramifications. Oh, good. 2 questions. Rabbi.
Well, since you talked about the missiles, do you know how many missiles have fallen in Israel since the time they pulled out of Gaza?
It's somewhere in the ballpark of 10,000. have actually landed. I mean, most of them were relatively harmless because they weren't made well. And early on, I'm sorry to laugh, they kept landing in Gaza. They would shoot them and they'd land on their own people. They've gotten a lot better. In the last Gaza war, they were able to come close to Tel Aviv. They certainly were able to reach Ashdod. And so there is obviously a concern about those missiles. And be aware, don't just look at the missiles coming from Gaza. Pay attention to the missiles coming from Lebanon in the hands of Hezbollah. And those missiles come in through the land, and they're coming in through the totally porous border of Iraq into Syria and into Lebanon. And the Israelis have on a number of occasions hit transports of weapons going into Lebanon. But that, I think that that's a bigger problem than coming in from Gaza. Hezbollah is led by probably the smartest, most capable anti-Israeli in the region, a man by the name of Mel Gibson. I'm sorry, I'm reading my notes wrong. I have to read these things. A man by the name of Hassan Nasrallah. I don't like him, I don't agree with him, but he's very good. Yes, sir.
You mentioned about the right to return the Palestinian refugees who lives in Syria. How easy is it to go to the West Bank if they choose to do so? And from what I understand, from personal experience, as an American citizen, not even a fly would cross the border to Israel without the Israeli authorities permitting them and asking. So I believe, I don't know, you need just to explain to people how easy is it to get, or how hard is it to get to anybody, to Israel or to the West Bank.
Well, that's exactly the point. I made that point earlier. You're exactly correct.
My question is,
yes.
You said, we talk about a lot, you said the Palestinians will not take those refugees back to the West Bank, and I disagree with that.
You think they would take them?
Well, if they're in a bind, I think as Palestinian, I would take my own people.
Well, you would.
I know, but also I don't think they had that option because you make it sound like it's easy for them just to go to the West Bank if they choose to do so.
Oh, it's not easy, but it is possible to get into the West Bank, but the Palestinian Authority won't let them in.
Do they have that option?
Sure.
By whom?
They could get into the West Bank through Jordan. They could get in. They could probably get in, but the Palestinian authorities made it very clear they won't take them.
But you need to state that they have to have the permission of the state of Israel first. Would the Israelis let them go to the West Bank? That's my question.
As part of an overall agreement, the Israeli solution to the issue of the right of return is, should there be a Palestinian state, the Palestinian refugees should go and live in the new state of Palestine. That's their goal, the Israeli goal. The Palestinian answer is, these people didn't come from the West Bank. They came from traditional Israel, and they don't want to go to the West Bank because that's not where they're from. So Israel allowing Palestinians into the West Bank in the long run is what they want.
I'm talking about now. Those Palestinians choose to go to the West Bank. Would the state of Israel let them go in? I'm asking you that.
I don't know the answer because it's not a question that the Israelis are facing because the Palestinians won't let them go in.
I read a lot about that, but I don't think that was it.
Okay, well, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I just don't know I don't know that the Israelis are blocking Palestinians from going from Syria into the West Bank. I do know the Palestinians are blocking Palestinians from moving into the West Bank. Either way, they're not getting there.
The Palestinians can't control even their own little security, and they have no control over the borders.
Yeah. Which is,
Who go in, who comes out.
Yep, you're exactly right on that. And that's, again, I mentioned earlier, the other border that is of concern is the Jordan Valley. The Israelis are concerned after they leave, if they leave, who controls that border? So control of borders, you're exactly right, is a concern that is part of the overall peace process that has to be worked out if it is to be worked out.
Well, I respect that. I don't mean to take
Yeah, no, that's okay. No one else is raising their hand.
As Palestinians in the city of Naples, my family who were born and raised, they can't just go drive in the morning and go to Naples and say we go back to our town.
Mhm.
That's not the Palestinians who tell them no, it's the Israelis who tell them no.
Mhm. Yeah. No, again.
It's not very easy. You just take off and go back.
Again, that raises another question, and that is one of the main issues is security. Having the IDF wandering around the West Bank prohibits movement of Palestinians in the West Bank and just increases tensions. Yes?
A slightly different topic, but I wondered if you could share any insights with us in terms of your feelings on the Obama administration's efforts with the Iranians, agreements, anything in that?
Okay. Obviously, you have to divide the question of dealing with Iran into two parts. The first is the nuclear question, and the second is Iran, without the nuclear issue, is still awful. They are supporting Hamas, they're supporting Hezbollah, they're providing chlorine bombs in the last couple of weeks to Syria. These are not even issues that are being talked about. The issue that is being talked about is the question of trying to slow down Iran's capability of enriching uranium, and in the Arak, not Iraq, facility to prevent them from enriching plutonium. A 6-month agreement was reached, which was reached in January, and it ends on July 20th, which has called for increased monitoring and supervision, a slowing down of the enrichment process in exchange for a release of ballpark $7 billion of trade and funds for Iran, during which time they should come up with a new agreement. And right now, the Rouhani administration in Iran seems to be a bit more flexible, for lack of a better term, to try and reach an agreement by the 20th. The economy of Iran did pick up after the agreement, and they hope to do so. The Obama administration is placing greater emphasis on monitoring of the nuclear agreement, should there be one. And the Israelis are saying that this is insufficient because Iran will still have the capability of enriching, and that they could always change the enrichment and increase it from the 5% or whatever the levels are to a higher level. And so I think, I would not be surprised if an agreement is reached by July 20th. And if it is, I would be very surprised that the Israelis are not very unhappy about this agreement. Yes, sir.
What's the impact on American involvement in Iraq on the situation? Was it helpful, unhelpful?
Iraq, I couldn't.
What was the impact of the American involvement in Iraq on the Jewish Arab situation? And should we have stayed, or was it helpful if we left?
Well, as someone who opposed the Iraq War from the very beginning, I think we made a mistake going in. The winner of the Iraq War was Iran. Maliki is a Shia and certainly gets support from Iran, and this is a bad thing. He is also unable to control cities in western Iraq, like Fallujah, which has now been taken over by the Al-Qaeda forces. And that's why the border between Syria and Iraq is open. So this is, Iraq is a major problem on so many different levels. And I'm very concerned about the future of Iraq. Did we pull out too early, or I don't know. It certainly spiraled down and was mishandled. Well, the Pacers have just scored.
Thank you very much for being here this evening. And again, if you have not signed up on our email list and would like to have announcements for further Pathways to Peace lectures, please do so at the back. And if you have not eaten, you need to do that, okay? So thank you again.